Welcome online friends to Improving Student Reflections in Electronic Portfolio Environments. My name is Dr. David Denton and I'm an instructor at Seattle Pacific University. In this presentation, I'd like to share the results of a study conducted with undergraduate students as they wrote entries to their electronic portfolios. The themes that this study was based on include evidence-based learning, writing instruction, and reflection. Let me give you an overview of where we'll be going today. During this presentation, I'll be sharing with you the method and results of a study conducted, beginning with the background and definitions, research questions, method, results, and discussion. I will be elaborating on each of these topics throughout the presentation. And at the end, I'll give you an overview of the types of interventions that were used during the study. Take a minute to pause this presentation and examine this concept map a little more closely for yourself. This study involved undergraduate students enrolled in a teacher training program at an independent liberal arts university. One of the program requirements involves having students set up and manage an electronic portfolio. This is pretty typical in teacher training programs. In the past, these portfolios were paper-based, usually in a 3-ring binder. But many schools of education have transitioned away from paper-based portfolios to electronic portfolios. This study is about improving student writing entries to their electronic portfolios. The study involved 2 research questions, a primary and secondary. The primary research question was, what instructional practices improve students' electronic portfolio entries? And another related question of interest was whether or not metadata such as tags and categories predict performance. And performance here is defined as the quality of written entries. So the first question you may have is, why writing? Why not some other construct such as content or technical know-how? Well, here's an example of a student's electronic portfolio, and I'll play this for you. As I play it, it's just going to scroll down. I want you to take a look and see how much writing is involved in comparison to, say, the other elements. So you'll notice that more than 2/3 of the electronic portfolio is filled with writing. There are, of course, various artifacts uploaded as images, and other elements such as tags, date of the entry, and so on. But most of the portfolio involves writing. And clearly, writing is a critical component to any electronic portfolio that is at least similar to this one. The goal for having students set up and maintain portfolios, at least in this context, is to show competency on program standards. That is, professional teacher knowledge and skills, dictated by the state for securing a teaching license. So the emphasis is on content, but this content is described and interpreted through writing. So one goal of the study was to understand how writing impacts portfolio performance. And I'd like to mention this quote, which interested me quite a bit as the study began, which is that when we're assessing students on performance, writing may be a source of construct irrelevant variance. So for instance, perhaps I want to know what a student understands about a particular science concept. Well, I've got a couple of options for finding out from that student about their knowledge. I can talk with them or have them write, or perhaps have them respond to some items. But very often we will have students respond in writing. So this means that as I assess, say, the science concept that I'm really targeting, I'm also simultaneously assessing their communication ability, that is, perhaps their writing ability. So I want to understand a little bit better about how to close that gap between the content that I want students to demonstrate, professional knowledge and skills or whatever, and their ability to write, and understand that connection, and also assist them in their writing so that they can clearly communicate to me about the content that I'm targeting. Let's outline the characteristics of each student's portfolio to give you an idea of what these looked like. First, students created their portfolios in the first year of the teaching program. So, at the time the study was started, they had been managing them and adding content to them anywhere from 8 to 9 months. Portfolios were made in WordPress. Here's the landing page. Each portfolio also had additional pages showing program standards, archive, widget, tags, and categories. And these categories corresponded to the program standards shown on these pages. There were also sections giving a short paragraph about the student, and then also about the purpose of the portfolio. Most of the entries were written to the blog portion, that is the landing page of the portfolio. And B portfolio stands for blog portfolio. There are a couple of constructs that should be mentioned that students were aware of as they were writing entries to their portfolio. One, students were asked to attend to the various program standards. These are the professional knowledge and skills that new teachers need to master in order to earn their license. So for instance, number 1, under category S, content driven, all students develop an understanding and problem-solving expertise in the content area using reading, written and oral communication, and technology. So this is one of the objectives for our student teachers to master. Similarly, students were asked to include artifacts, for instance, lesson plans they had written. Another form of artifact came from the actual students they were working from, perhaps a homework assignment. And these artifacts were used as evidence to support and show that indeed our teacher candidates had mastered the particular program standard. So these are summarized as artifacts and program standards, two elements that were involved as students wrote entries to their blog portfolios. Here's an exemplar, a very good example of what we were attempting to have students do. Take and write an entry, insert some student evidence, and analyze that evidence, and then also reflect on the program standard, either explicitly or tacitly, more ideally explicitly throughout. So you can take a moment and have a look at this entry. You'll notice over here the tag cloud that this student has been working on, and anytime that a blog entry is made, he or she would add a tag, and of course the size of the tag grows depending upon the amount that it's used, and then also the category. So once a blog entry was made, it was categorized according to one of the various program standards, L1, L2, and so on. So this student has 72 entries under L1. Well, let me give you a few details about the context and participants. The students involved in this study were in the middle of a 14-week internship. They were undergraduates, and there were 11 of them, mostly females. Now this isn't uncommon. Other studies, such as the one by Yao et al., Ayan, Seferoglu, Shepard, and Hanifin, all involved 8 or less participants, and they were actually of a qualitative nature. So this study shows some progress in this area, although there's certainly more to be done with larger sample sizes. Nevertheless, here was the general method that we used. Repeated measures on 3 portfolio entries. So a rubric was constructed according to the criteria we were attempting to achieve, and then this rubric was used to assess 3 different entries. The first entry was written 8 months before the intervention, before the study began, and the second entry was written about a week before the intervention started, and the third entry was written during the intervention. So 3 different measures were applied. The same rubric was used to score all 3 entries, and this was developed from AACU, American Association of Colleges and Universities Value Rubrics System, and the inter-rater reliability, as the rubric was used across entries, was 0.82, so pretty reasonable for this type of study. So here's a visual. The rubric was used to assess each entry, and the intervention spanned 5 days. And as was suggested earlier, the purpose of applying the rubric was to determine the quality of the writing according to these criteria, which were closely linked to program standards and the use of artifacts. And t-tests were run to compare the scores from the first to the third entry and from the second to the third entry to determine if there was any change over time and any change according to the application of the intervention. So as I mentioned, there was a secondary research question whether or not these tag clouds and the number of entries actually predicted the quality of written entries. Here's another nice example. You can look that over. The number of unique terms in the tag clouds were counted. Now by unique terms I mean these types of phrases such as classroom management, differentiated instruction, diversity, and so forth. These terms where the course number was shown were not used as part of that count because they're not necessarily unique terms. Those are just more associated with the particular class that the student was taking. In addition, you could easily count up the number of entries by searching through the archives or categories. So those numbers were also summed. And then simple correlations, Pearson coefficient correlations, were calculated to determine whether or not the number of tag clouds in terms was predictive of the writing quality score. And here's the line of best fit for those sets of data. Well, let's take a look at the results. So the first entry, when the rubric was utilized to assess students' first entry, they earned a score of about 0.55, about 0.6. The second entry was much higher, about 2.3. And these scores were calculated out of an 8-point scale. Here are some additional statistics related to scores for the third entry. So you will recall that t-tests were conducted between the first and third entry, second and third entry. Results showed that the third entry was significantly higher in score in comparison to the second and the first, at a statistical alpha level of 0.01, less than 0.01. So there was a pretty good gain over time as a result of the intervention to improve a student's writing on that third entry. Similarly, there was a statistically significant correlation between the number of unique terms shown in the tag cloud and the quality of that third entry, as well as the number of entries overall related to the quality of that third entry. So what does this all mean? Well, first, the intervention did indeed improve the writing quality on the third entry. And although writing quality was fairly narrowly defined according to the rubric, it nevertheless is quite important, since students are required to show mastery of various professional knowledge and skills in order to earn their teaching licenses. Second, use of metadata did indeed predict general writing quality, more specifically that third entry, but that metadata could be used as an informal method for assessing the general performance of students' electronic portfolios overall. Well, let's revisit the concept map for a moment. So we've covered some of the details, most of the relevant details of the study. Now let's discuss real quickly the pieces of the intervention, which really did focus on improving students' writing. So, explicit direction on content and format, communication of assessment criteria, evaluating evidence, instructor and peer feedback, and revising. Pause this presentation and take a look again at the concept map, and we'll take a quick overview of these pieces of the intervention. Great. Well, one of the first characteristics of the intervention was clear and explicit direction on content and format. This was done through the use of writing prompts, as well as clear and simple, not very long, instructions on what to do and how to do it. Second, communication of the assessment criteria. A second rubric, one that wasn't associated with generating a score for running the t-tests, was constructed in order to help students understand how they would have their entries assessed, that is, the assessment criteria. And this rubric had a variety of characteristics. I'll be sharing those with you during the informational session. A third characteristic was evaluating evidence, helping students to understand that their writing needed to show some evidence, that is, artifacts that they had created through their coursework or that they had had their own students make as a way to validate and reinforce their claims. And helping them integrate these artifacts and evidence was done by questioning, just asking students what various artifacts they'd used and why they chose them and so on. Another characteristic, perhaps one of the most important, was instructor and peer feedback. So students had the opportunity to submit their entries and get feedback from the instructor, and they also submitted them to a peer, and the other student was able to assess that entry using the assessment rubric and give feedback to the students. And we had students also identify strengths and weaknesses of those entries. Now this didn't take very long, a few minutes from the instructor and a few minutes from the peer. But it did indeed have a significant effect because students were able to self-assess as well as peer assess and then think about corrections, which leads us to the final characteristic, which was the opportunity to revise. So students initially submitted their third entry, received instructor feedback, and then they worked through an activity and received peer feedback, and they made their final submission a few days after this entire process. Well, thanks for listening. I hope to work with you a little bit more during the informational session on improving student reflections in electronic portfolio environments, where we will practice some of these techniques of designing interventions according to the characteristics that I've suggested for your particular discipline, content area, and students.